Okay. So we left off talking about the steps that were necessary for speciation. And I said that really we're returning to the idea of a biological species concept here, that we're thinking about organisms that are reproducing together and interbreeding. We're not talking about asexual organisms, right? Some of when we get into those other organisms, these same basic things apply. The reproductive isolation might be a little bit less, but we definitely have to have genetic divergence. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about ways in which that can happen, and then I'm going to talk about mechanisms that can get us to being separate and staying separate. Okay, so there's two main types of speciation. There's allopatric speciation and there's sympatric speciation. And allopatric speciation means that we have a population of organisms and it is divided somehow. There's an actual barrier that separates members of that population, and then they carry on with their lives, but now they might be experiencing different environments, they might have different mutations pop up in their populations, and they're no longer intermixing, right? And not going back over the pass anymore. The genetic information is no longer exchanging, so we have genetic divergence. Okay. Sympatric speciation occurs when a new species arises without a physical separation. Okay. And there are some different ways that that can happen, and we're going to go and talk about those in detail. But with sympatric speciation, we're staying in the same place. Organisms are not physically divided, but they become reproductively isolated, and genetic divergence occurs even though there's no physical barrier. Okay, those same two steps still happen. So the word allopatric speciation, allopatric means other fatherland. So allo is the other and patric is fatherland, like Patros. So other fatherland, things happen in different places. Okay, populations are separated by geographic barriers, and they then take on separate evolutionary pathways. The isolated populations become genetically unique, and they generally speciate and separate because of factors like natural selection, because of mutation, and because of genetic drift. And we're going to come back and define mutation and genetic drift in chapter 19. So we'll look at those actual mechanisms more closely. The example I have here is of two species of ground squirrel who were separated by the formation of the Grand Canyon. At some point in time, before the formation of the Grand Canyon, we had one species of antelope ground squirrel running around. And as the river came through the wash and widened, as soon as that water is wide enough, those two squirrels couldn't get back together anymore because they're on opposite sides of a river they can't cross. And over that evolutionary time, if you go and look at these species now, on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, we have the Harris's antelope ground squirrel, and on the north rim, we have the white-tailed antelope ground squirrel. They're no longer the same species. They've been separated by this giant geographic barrier for a long period of time. That process, something like the formation of the Grand Canyon, is an example of vicariance. And so the word vicariance refers to speciation that occurs because a natural occurrence creates physical barriers. So we had one population of ground squirrels. As the Grand Canyon formed, that one population was split into two that were separated. And so because there was a physical variance or physical barrier, they experienced vicariance. Another example of this is in the snapping shrimp. If you look along the Isthmus of Panama that separates the Atlantic Ocean from the Pacific Ocean, there are 15 different groups, 15 pairs of snapping shrimp. And if you look at all 30 of these species of snapping shrimp and you map which species are the most closely related to each other, in every single instance, they form pairs of close relatedness with one species on the Atlantic side and one species on the Pacific side. And so it seems pretty clear that at one point in time, there were probably 15 species of snapping shrimp, and they were freely moving around in all of this water when water levels were higher and the Isthmus of Panama was not dividing them. And then as water receded and land lifted, we end up in a position where they're now separated by the Isthmus of Panama. And so now our species pairs occur across this barrier, with these two species being more closely related to each other than this species is to this species, or than this species is to this species, right? So even though these guys are on the same side, they're not that closely related to each other. This individual's closest relative is on the other side of the isthmus. Does that make sense? So that's another example of that allopatric speciation. We have a physical barrier and vicariance creating a boundary, and then those species, because they're separated, are no longer having genetic exchange, and they carry on different pathways.
For example, the two species that are at the bottom, right? Mm-hmm. You say they're not as closely related as the ones that are across each other. At some point, there was an area in the middle, somewhere in the middle, in which neither one existed. Is that why they started to not being?
Yeah, and there's other species. So this is only showing 4 species. There's a total of 30 species that are in here, and they probably have all sorts of little microhabitats that have to do with how much depth they tolerate, what species they feed on, and other things that separate them. Yeah, other factors that help to keep them separate. Yeah, that's a great question, though. Okay. Another type of allopatric speciation can occur because of dispersal events. And dispersal is a natural process. Species disperse. It is how species expand their ranges and take up for larger habitat zones. Species can disperse in response to overcrowding. Their population gets too big and some individuals get up and leave. Some of those individuals might go to an area that is less desirable because they just need to go somewhere because they're running out of room, right? Organisms might disperse because there aren't a lot of good mating opportunities for them there. And we frequently see males get up and leave. They're having a hard time finding an appropriate mate in their population, and so they're going to go on a voyage and see if they can find a mate somewhere else, right? Dispersal can have a lot of different functions, but it can also function as a mechanism for allopatric speciation. If a group of organisms or a handful, even just a few organisms, get up and go somewhere else, they can find a new population and start a new population. And so that's probably what happened with spotted owls. We currently have the northern spotted owls range here and the Mexican spotted owls range here. These two species are really similar. They're very closely related, but they are different, and they have different adaptations now to the environments that they live in. It's warmer and drier in their southern range. It's cooler and moister in their northern range. The tree species that they're obligated to are slightly different. And probably at some point in time, some individuals from one of these populations left and found some other habitat that was pretty good. And they settled down there and started to reproduce and started to put more individuals into that area. And then over evolutionary time, they became more suited to that area. Right? They got better at living in a drier, hotter environment, whichever way it went. I actually don't know which of these is the founding population, and I don't know if science knows. I didn't find a quick, easy answer, so I don't know either way. So both of these, vicariance and dispersal, whether we have a physical boundary, like in vicariance, or a physical boundary of distance, because some individuals got up and left and dispersed, we have individuals evolving in separate locations. So they're geographically isolated. That also provides reproductive isolation, and then they diverge genetically. Does that make sense? Okay. We can also see, particularly when organisms find themselves in a new wide open niche, we can see what's called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation is sort of separate from but related to allopatric speciation. It's often a dispersal type mechanism where we have individuals who show up somewhere where there are no individuals of that type. And so think of islands forming, right? If you think about the Hawaiian Islands pushing up out of the Pacific Ocean, volcanoes erupt, lava flows and cools, and now we have an island, right? Early on in that island's life, we have some primary succession. We have some small seeds that are able to, lichens and mosses that are able to form that start to create some substrate, and then some small seeds that can settle into that substrate and begin to grow some plants, right? Whatever lands there has to be what blows out from the mainland or floats out in the ocean, or is brought there by birds or humans or other organisms that are dropping by, right? But as that island starts to become a functioning habitat, imagine that there's a big windstorm or a big event, and a couple of birds get blown out to that island, right? Now they're stuck there. They got there because of a drastic event, and there isn't really anywhere else for them to go, so they're going to make their living. And we see this in a lot of islands where we have a group of species or a species arise that gives rise to a whole bunch of different types of species, usually that have really different feeding behaviors. So this is an example of honey creepers in Hawaii. The founding species was this mainland bird here that probably got blown out there during a storm event, and over evolutionary time developed into these 6 different species. And that's because once they got there were different ways to make your living. Some individuals specialized on drinking nectar from flowers. Other individuals consumed nectar and insects. Some individuals become specialists of eating nectar. Then look at the beak on this one. Some got good at cracking open seeds, right? There's a really deep, strong beak there. And so as you sort of disperse and go to different feeding types, you can see this pretty rapid, like over evolutionary time, it's like a snapshot. It happens so fast. This rapid development of many new species, and that's called adaptive radiation. And so it happens much faster in terms of getting from 1 species to 6 species than you would see if we just had 1 species became 2 and 2 became 4 and 4 became 8. That would take much more time than when we have a founding species land in a wide open habitat where the niches are all available. And there's lots of opportunity to test out different ways of making a living. It is very similar, right? And it is essentially the same kind of mechanism. We have a physical barrier, we have reproductive isolation, and genetic divergence. The real difference is that in allopatric speciation, strict allopatric speciation, we're usually talking about a physical barrier separating a population into 2 populations. And in this case, we don't really have 2 populations. We have 1 population, the handful of birds that landed there, and then they radiate into a bunch of different species. And so they separate themselves from the mainland species. That's like 1 step of separation. But this species becoming all of these species doesn't actually require physical separation or physical barriers, but rather that they are specializing on different food types or living on different parts of the island, right? And so once they get there, they're like, oh, we got all this space. They kind of spread out and pretty rapidly become multiple different species. So the differences are very subtle, though, because you still have, I mean, a lot of the same mechanisms are in place and a lot of the same steps are happening. It's just sort of the splitting of 1 species into 2 versus the splitting of 1 species fairly rapidly into many, right?
So now which means that they were forced, a little like kind of forced to get separated as in this, like you said, they started spreading and they had the space and started spreading by themselves. That's
right. Yeah. In this case, it's usually based on what is there to eat or where is there to find shelter. And so once they land there, like, they didn't really have a whole lot of control. They were flying around and the wind picked them up and shoved them out there usually. Or a strong storm. You see the same thing with organisms that can swim, getting swept into the ocean and then washing up on land, like iguanas and stuff like that. So yeah, they were sort of forced there, but then once they were there, it was like, oh, I'll take advantage of this option versus that option. But these, as this founding species is becoming all of these species, these guys can still interact. Like it's not like there's a mountain range between them. They can still come into contact with each other, and they may do a little bit of mating and hybridizing, especially in the early days, as they're separating themselves out. Early days of evolution, not early days of any individual's life, before they become completely different species. Yeah. It's a good question. Okay, so this diagram kind of tries to help show that difference, what makes it adaptive radiation unique and different from just regular speciation. So if we were just looking at regular speciation, we have our evolutionary tree going from sometime in the past to sometime in the present. So this is evolutionary time on the x-axis. We start with a single species, and that single species branches into these two pathways, right? The species that ends up on this pathway splits again, so that this one species has now become these two species through evolutionary time, right? On this pathway, this species splits, and then this species splits again. And we kind of are getting more species as we go further down through evolutionary time. In adaptive radiation, excuse me, this species finds itself on the island and then splits quite rapidly in evolutionary time into many species. So instead of having that sort of stepwise multiple speciation events, we kind of have this one big speciation event where these organisms find themselves in a habitat that's wide open with lots of unoccupied niches. And so they can take over those niches, and that allows them to pretty rapidly differentiate, because one individual decides it likes to drink flower nectar and one individual is liking to eat insects, and then they're just spending their time doing different things. And so they become reproductively isolated pretty rapidly if they're focusing on different things. So I don't know, I wouldn't say that there are none, but I don't know any of examples of adaptive radiation happening that wasn't on something like an island chain, where you do have these sort of wide open, unoccupied niches. I'm not aware of it happening in a place where lots of other things were already living and that kind of scenario. So I think that it's usually a matter of that we have all these unoccupied niches and there's no real pressure to stay here and eat this one thing with the other friends that came over with you, because you're like, oh, there's flowers here and there's seeds here and look at these new insects I've never seen before, they're tasty, and you just kind of like head off in different directions. Oh, yeah, of course. Like over the grand scheme of all of the evolutionary timeline of the history of Earth, absolutely, right? Because whoever this guy was here, he's got some history behind it, right? So somewhere back here, there were other speciation events, other branches. Certainly, if we're talking in this example about birds, at some point in time, it wasn't a flying individual, it was a walking lizard-like individual, right? So we go back through evolutionary time. So yeah. So that's a good question. I feel like all of the examples, like if you ask me to like think of all the examples I know of adaptive radiation off the top of my head, like 50% of them would be birds. Some of them are plants. Um, and then I think lizards would be the next. It might have to do with who's likely to land in an island chain, because those are all the examples that are coming to my mind. Um, Certainly there has to be some mammalian adaptive radiations too. I would have to pull up a list of examples because I don't know if it's more. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. So you see it happen quickly. That could be. That's a good hypothesis, because things that are longer lived would be there for a longer time before they would start selecting. And so if you're looking at a snapshot through evolutionary time, the line would seem longer. Imagine we'd compensate for that, but it's a good hypothesis. Yeah. You guys have clearly tapped my knowledge on adaptive radiation, like gone past my knowledge. I'm going to close this door really quick. I want to go ahead and move away from allopatric speciation and adaptive radiation and go ahead and talk, other classic example of adaptive radiation is the Galapagos finches. And so I had the Galapagos and all of the finches that the common ancestor became throughout the Galapagos island chain. This is another example, kind of like the honey creepers, of lots and lots of different bird species evolving from one founder species. But I want to move on and talk about sympatric speciation. And sympatric speciation, the word sympatric means together, fatherland. So unlike allopatric speciation, we don't have a physical distance or a physical barrier between the species that arise. Instead, they arise in the same place. And so new species arise within the same geographic area as parent species. And probably one of the easiest examples to wrap your head around is this example of hawthorn trees and apple trees. So hawthorn trees are native to North America, and prior to apple trees being widely sort of domesticated and planted throughout farms and orchards, hawthorn trees were pretty abundant and would have been the primary mating site for a group of flies, hawthorn apple flies. And so the flies live on the hawthorn tree, they feed on it, and the individuals come together and do their courtship and mating display on the hawthorn, and then lay the eggs on the apple itself. The larvae hatch, and then they munch on the fruit. Okay. So when apple trees became available, some of the flies were like, oh, that looks like a good place to mate and lay my eggs. And so some of the individuals moved over to apple trees, and some individuals stayed on hawthorn trees. And so although there's no physical barrier and there's nothing separating them, they became reproductively isolated by their preference for the smell or the color or the size of apple fruits versus hawthorn fruits. Right? Some individuals were attracted to the apples, and they mated with other individuals that were attracted to the apples. And the individuals who didn't notice the apples or didn't think anything of them continued to mate on the hawthorns. Right? And so then, pretty relatively quickly, evolutionarily, the individuals who are mating on the apples aren't even interacting with the individuals mating on the hawthorns anymore. And so now we have reproductive separation because of preference, host plant preference, preference for the mates that are in the same place that you're in. Right? And so that's an example of sympatric speciation. The flies that are spending their time on the apple tree quit encountering the hawthorn flies, the populations diverge, and now we have two different species of this type of fly, the hawthorn fly and the apple fly. Okay. Does that make sense? Anybody has any questions about that? The other way that we can have sympatric speciation, and this happens fairly often, particularly in plants, is through aneuploidies combined with self-fertilization. And so if you remember from Bio 1, an aneuploidy is an accident of cell division where the chromosomes fail to separate completely, either during meiosis 1 or meiosis 2, right? And so in this particular example here, we have a diploid individual, a 2N individual who has a total of 4 chromosomes. When that cell divides, if non-disjunction occurs during meiosis, some of the gametes have fewer chromosomes than expected, and some of the gametes have more chromosomes than expected, right? If those gametes fuse with a normal gamete that has the full chromosome number, we end up with some normal cells that have the typical diploid parent number that we started with, some cells that have too many chromosomes, and some cells that have too few chromosomes. Normally, some of these gametes would not necessarily be compatible with other gametes because the chromosomes wouldn't be able to fuse properly during reproduction. But because these individuals, especially in plants, are able to self-fertilize, they may have multiple cells that are compatible and are able to fertilize themselves. You can actually have within the period of a generation, plants can double their chromosome number through some of these accidents of cell division. And so we see new species arise not over evolutionary time, but like in a generation because of accidents of cell division that resulted in viable individuals. Those individuals might not be able to mate with any of the other plants that they came from, but they can mate with themselves and they produce viable seed. And now we've got a founding individual of one creating its own population. Does that make sense? Okay. Can also happen, oh, this is what I just said, going through the self-fertilization process and coming up with a tetraploid species. And it can also happen when a species actually crosses with another species. And so you can have, in this case, a normal gamete and a polyploid gamete that come together. And so the polyploid is sort of this new, just arisen by an accident of cell division, and it fuses with a normal gamete. And in the first generation, things don't work out very well. But if it's able to mate again with a normal gamete that pairs up with these chromosomes, then all of a sudden now on the second mating, we've created a whole nother species that has even more chromosomes than the first case. And so the first type of cell division error in which the individual just mates with itself is called autoploidy. The second type is called alloploidy. Again, these are just italicized. I'm not going to ask you to know these names. I'm not going to ask you to describe these errors of cell division. Just know that we can have these polyploid events occur because of errors in cell division, and we can end up with a new species pretty much almost instantaneously in evolutionary time frame. Right? In one generation, we can end up with a new species, as opposed to generation after generation after generation of speciation and separation. Some scientists estimate that about 80% of current plant species arose this way due to accidents of cell division combined with self-fertilization or cross-fertilization resulting in new species pretty instantly. And in particular, a number of the plants that are really important to us for food plants, like things like wheat and rye, oats, many of them are polyploid species, which is just interesting. Do you guys have this? Are you still writing? Okay. So I want to come back to what keeps species from hybridizing, what keeps them from coming together. How do we maintain reproductive isolation? And then if reproductive isolation breaks down, what happens? And so we're going to look first at things that maintain this idea of reproductive isolation and keep species separate. And then we're going to look at what happens when we have hybrid zones. So the first thing we're going to talk about are those things that provide reproductive barriers, ways that we actually keep species separate. Sorry. We're going to break these down into two different time periods reproductively, prezygotic and postzygotic. Can anybody guess what this means, prezygotic and postzygotic? before a zygote, right? What's a zygote? It's a little baby, right? The egg and the sperm fuse and come together and make a zygote, right? So prezygotic means a mechanism that prevents egg and sperm from ever coming together, okay? Postzygotic means that egg and sperm come together, but that doesn't result in a successful, viable offspring. Okay? So prezygotic barriers are going to prevent individuals of different species from ever fertilizing an egg with a sperm. Postzygotic barriers are going to prevent fertilized zygotes from becoming viable fertile offspring. Okay? So we're going to go through and look at a number of different examples. These reproductive barriers arise over evolutionary time. So when we're going through a speciation event, right, and we have species that are being separated, say it's an allopatric speciation, say these are our squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon, right? When they're originally separated, they might be more than happy to come together and mate and produce viable offspring. But 100 generations down the line or 1,000 generations down the line, something has arisen that makes it so that that's no longer easy or no longer viable. It means that a baby is never formed. So it means that sperm and egg never come together. Okay. That's the pre. The post means that if sperm and egg come together, then the hybrid doesn't live long or is not fertile itself. And so then the hybrid itself doesn't reproduce again. Right, but it's not able to make new offspring for another generation. Yep. Okay. So the first prezygotic barrier is something that prevents mating or fertilization is what we call a geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is the easiest to understand, right? Now there's a giant river in the way and we can't get to each other. Now there's a mountain range in the way and we can't get to each other. Doesn't mean we might not happily mate if there weren't a barrier, but the barrier prevents individuals from coming together, okay? This is another example of species that are separated by the Grand Canyon. The kaibab squirrel is only found on the north rim, and the Abert squirrel is only found on the south rim. They were probably one species before the Grand Canyon formed, and their physical separation prevents them from coming back together. Okay, they can't in nature come together unless maybe one of them gets in a hiker's backpack and happens to make the whole journey, right? Like it'd be hard pressed to get from one place to the other place. Anytime you have a river, a mountain range, an isthmus or a barrier in land or in water, some sort of physical separation. Okay. You can also have habitat isolation. And so in habitat isolation, you don't necessarily have a physical barrier, but you're separated because you're spending time in different habitats. And so this is kind of like the hawthorn fly and the apple fly, right? They're not physically separated from each other, but they're preferring to spend their time in different trees, and therefore they're separated. The example that I have here is a white-crowned sparrow and a white-throated sparrow. If either one of these flew by my binoculars, I would be hard-pressed to know which one it was unless I could get out a field guide quick enough and look them up, right? But the white-crowned sparrow is found out in open meadows, and it's going to be perching on tops of bunches of tall grass or, you know, small little woody vegetation that might be in a meadow. It's going to be eating and reproducing and making its nests out in the meadow, right? The white-throated sparrow likes to be in conifers and in denser woodlands. And so it's going to be eating and making its nest and looking for mates in the forest. And so these guys aren't going to be coming together because of habitat isolation. Does that make sense? What does temporal mean? time-related, factor of time, right? So temporal isolation is isolation in time, right? So the first two isolations, geographic and habitat, are isolation in space, right? Temporal isolation is isolation in time. And so when you have species that are separated by time, it means that they're not reproductively active at the same time, right? This might be because they have their activity at different times of day. Some individuals might be, or one species might be nocturnal, only active at night. The other species might be diurnal, and they never interact because they're sleeping at different times and they're active at different times, right? Other individuals might have their mating period occur at different times of day or different times of year. Many species, this is especially true in mammals, are only reproductively receptive once a year in our temperate latitudes. In the tropics, that disappears because conditions are always good for mating. But in temperate latitudes, lots of species are only receptive at one period of time in a year. So if the eastern spotted skunk is looking for mates in March, and the western spotted skunk is looking for mates in April, anywhere that they might overlap, they're not going to be in mating condition at the same time, and therefore they won't mate. Does that make sense? Same if one of these species is diurnal and the other is nocturnal, which is not true. Then we have behavioral isolation. This is probably my favorite because I'm an animal behaviorist and behavior is always really fun, right? So behavioral isolation is anytime you have some sort of ritual or song or dance that helps you to identify other members of your same species as potential mates, okay? I don't have a link. I feel like we almost need to just take a minute and watch a video of the blue-footed boobies mating dance. Yeah, I don't know if I could pull one up quick enough. Let me see. You'll wait. I know you will. I'm like, how do I not have a blue-footed booby link here? They're just so cool. Than those feet, right? That might be part of the decision-making process. But it also makes sure that you don't accidentally mate with an individual who has red feet, which isn't of your species, right? So going through that courtship ritual allows you to assess each other both for species identity and then also for mate quality, right? The same is true for songs. When we first started this lecture, I showed you the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark, and I said I can't tell them apart, but they can tell each other apart. One of the ways that many birds tell each other apart is by their vocalization. And so if you sing the same song as me, then we're members of the same species. If you don't sing the same song, I can't hear you, I'm not interested in you, right? And they separate out by song. All of those things are behavioral isolation, whether it's a song you sing, a call you make, a ritual, a gift giving activity where you have to bring a gift and do a display. All of those things are behaviors. And usually they're more complex than just, are we members of the same species? But it also tells you something about quality. Like you're singing the right song and it's also pleasing to my ear, right? And so now I think you might be a potential mate for me. So that's a way to keep individuals from accidentally mating with members of the wrong species. Okay. And then we come to mechanical incompatibilities. And mechanical incompatibilities are just what they sound like. The structures don't fit together and therefore mating is not possible. Okay. So different physical structures prevent mating from happening. So here we have a purple foxglove flower and an orange trumpet creeper. In order to get nectar from the foxglove, the bee is able to just go into the edge of the flower and drink that nectar. In order to reach the nectar of the trumpet creeper, you have to be able to get all the way back down into the base of the flower. And so the pollinators here, the hummingbird and the bee, are feeding in different ways in the flowers and are accessing different parts of the flowers. And so if the bee were to come over to the trumpet creeper, it would not actually be able to fit far enough down into the flower to deposit pollen. And so there is a structural incompatibility. The pollinator who prefers that species actually can't fit into the other species, so the pollen wouldn't be accidentally delivered to the wrong place. Does that make sense? Can anybody guess what these are pictures of? It is not the inside of a flower. It's an animal part. It is not a tongue. It's not a proboscis. Riley's going to bring it home. Those are dragonfly penises. Yeah. So, and dragonfly penises are really, really fascinating because they work like a lock and key fit. So in order to copulate with the female individuals, the penis has to be the right shape and the right length in order to actually deliver sperm to the right location in the female's body. And so you'll notice this one is single and kind of club shaped. This one has a hook on the end. Both of these are bifurcated, which means they're actually V's, and that's because the receptacle that receives them is V-shaped, and they have to be able to access both sides in order to deliver sperm. Usually the ones that are hooked, some dragonflies actually have like things that look like little scrub brushes on the end of their penises also that will remove the sperm from the previous individual or scrape out the previous individual and then deposit theirs. And that's a type of sperm competition that occurs. And so these are really complex copulation structures that make sure that you can't accidentally copulate with an individual that's not the right species. You could try, but you wouldn't actually have egg and sperm come together, right? Okay. That's the last prezygotic. So if you want to do a little dash line or whatever, we're going to move into postzygotic. Do you guys have any questions about any of the prezygotic mechanisms? Okay. Postzygotic mechanisms prevent vigorous or fertile hybrids. So now we're no longer preventing egg and sperm from coming together. The egg and sperm are going to come together and maybe a zygote is formed, right? But either that zygote is not going to make it to adulthood, or it's going to be weak and sickly, or it's going to be infertile itself so it can't produce the next generation. Okay. The first way that we can prevent a vigorous or fertile hybrid from coming together, even if the gametes find themselves in the same space, is by what we call gametic incompatibility. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, because of the hybrid vigor, is that just like, is that species have to be closer, more closely related from the get-go? Like, and then you could
What?
Post-zygotic barrier would that be like, oh, the species are just too far apart to begin with for hybrid vigor?
Not necessarily, because usually hybridization occurs when the species are actually pretty close. Like they're still close enough to find each other attractive, to come together and mate, to have a hybrid form. Usually the vigor is a way to say, actually, this isn't a good fit for the environment, and so this individual isn't going to survive well, and therefore natural selection should select against it. Did anybody listen to the radio lab I sent out about the bears? No, not yet. I've really just sent that out. But like I used to use polar bears and grizzly bears as my example for this lecture. I had to go change my lecture because now the story has changed. And it turns out that that was one female polar bear who mated with two grizzly bears. She mated with one of those two twice, and her offspring were viable. And then her offspring went and mated with one of the grizzlies that mom had mated with. So it's really kind of a unique, tangled situation, as opposed to like, hey, when grizzlies and polar bears come together, they just hybridize, right? It was really just this one female and her offspring that were doing this so far in what we're seeing. And the offspring, if you listen to that story, just really aren't good grizzly bears, and they aren't good polar bears. Their hair isn't quite as warm as it should be for polar bear. Their paws aren't as good at digging. Their muzzles aren't as good at foraging for the type of food that they would eat if they were either species. And so the in-between version doesn't have good vigor, meaning it doesn't survive well. It doesn't live long and prosper. Right? She could be unique that she's able to hybridize. It could also be like she could be unique in that she's able to successfully make offspring, or she could be unique in that she's at all attracted to grizzly bears, right? Either one of those is possible. Yeah. Okay, so let's come back to our first postzygotic barrier. And the first postzygotic barrier is what we call gametic incompatibility. And so in this case, egg and sperm are going to find themselves in the same place, but they're not actually going to be able to come together. And so gametes from different species can't physically unite even if they're together. And this is something that is really important for large numbers of reef-dwelling species. So lots of species of different types who find themselves living in places like coral reefs. Like here we have two different species of urchins, these blue species and this red species. Often the cue for mating, because these organisms are sedentary, they don't actually come together and copulate, but instead they release their gametes into the water. And so the trigger is usually a full moon night at low tide or high tide or, whatever at a certain time of year. And often what happens is that every species of sedentary organism on the reef throws its gametes into the water on the same night. And the water is literally like swirling with egg and sperm. And the egg and sperm wash around in the water and bump into each other. And hopefully some individuals manage to cross fertilize, right? So if a sperm from this red urchin species bumps into an egg from the blue urchin species, there are a couple of different things that might happen. The sperm might not have the necessary enzymes to tunnel in to the egg. The egg might recognize it as an intruder and eat it, basically decompose it and break it down. And so there are different signals that can happen at the chemical level as opposed to like sort of mechanical isolation or separation so that egg and sperm never come together. They come together and then they can't actually successfully have a fertilization event because they're incompatible biochemically. Does that make sense? So gametic incompatibility is usually biochemical.
I thought like postzygotic was a fertilization.
This one I feel like is on the edge. We usually call gametic incompatibility, like every textbook puts it in postzygotic because the zygote could form. And sometimes the mechanical incompatibilities, the sperm does actually get in to the egg and then it's broken down once it comes through the envelope. And so it can kind of be on either side of that, but it is right in between. Is that your same question? Yeah, it's on the edge because the zygote might form, but like as in that they come together but the DNA doesn't merge, or it might just be that they come into physical contact with each other but can't actually have the fertilization event. And this is relatively rare, like in all of the sexually reproducing species out there. These examples, almost all of them that I know of are aquatic, and most of them are marine aquatic. And so it's a subset of species that are experiencing where their eggs and sperm could actually come together without there being a mating event. Oh, this is just me with a silly cartoon. Often the egg has some kind of a barrier, which is my reminder to make sure I say that. Often the sperm is treated like the same way a bacteria or a virus would be treated. It's attacked by the egg and decomposed. Okay. If we actually have successful fertilization, a hybrid is formed. Now we have a hybrid individual that is a living, breathing individual. It can experience hybrid inviability or can experience hybrid infertility. And in hybrid inviability, the hybrids either don't develop fully or don't survive. So by not developing fully, they might mostly develop, but not reach adulthood. They might, form a juvenile and they're not very successful and they don't usually survive to adulthood. So there's no chance for them to reach their sexual maturity, their reproductive maturity state. This is an example of two salamanders that readily hybridize. This is one species and this is the other species. This is the hybrid offspring, and the hybrid offspring go off and live a little juvenile life, but they don't make it to sexual reproduction. And so they die in their juvenile phase. They're not able to make it to full adulthood. And so although they, seemingly have intact reproductive structures, they don't ever make it to a place where they can try to mate. And so often the hybrid is just not great at living. And so I said that the bear example, they aren't quite as well adapted for the cold as they need to be, but they're not adapted for feeding in the warmer climates. And so they're just kind of, it's a misfit to the environment and they don't do well. As opposed to hybrid infertility, where the hybrids are robust and healthy and they live long lives, but they're infertile. And so this is sort of classic example of horse and donkey producing a mule. A mule is a good sturdy beast. It's the friend you want in the mountains, right? They're great pack animals. They live long lives, but they are sterile. They just can't produce new offspring. So the only way you get more mules is to breed a horse and a donkey together again and make another mule offspring. Mules cannot reproduce with each other, and they can't back reproduce with either horses or donkeys. So the only way you get a new mule is to have a new hybrid formed.
For this example, if you get a mule, is there the same probability if you have a female donkey with a male horse than if you have a female horse?
Does anybody remember which way is which? I can never keep track. If you have one, so a mule and a donkey, a horse and a donkey either make a mule or a jack. And it depends on whether the horse is the female and the donkey is the male, or the donkey is the female and the horse is the male. And so, but they're both mules and jackasses are infertile hybrids. That's a good question. I don't know. Do they have a drive to mate? I don't know. Okay. So then a jack would be the offspring of a male horse, right? So it usually is not that they don't have reproductive organs. Usually the external genitalia manage to develop pretty well. Usually they can't make sperm, or they make sperm, but the sperm are weak swimmers, or they have, often, especially in males, the external genitalia is not just for reproduction, but also serves functions in urination. And so these things are tightly tied together. Usually the external genitalia in, lots of misconfigurations, the external genitalia is okay, but it's usually the cellular components that are not okay. So either the ovaries are not fully developed and eggs are not released. Doesn't mean that they don't have eggs, but the eggs aren't released. Or the sperm don't form fully. They're not good swimmers. They don't reach their destination. It's usually something like that. Did you have another question over here, Krishana? I think it's like, I don't know what their physical differences are. It's a difference in which parent provided which cross, but I think jacks must not be as useful to humans. I'm like, oh, what is the right term here? Because I feel like mules are much more common than jacks. But one's bigger. But you can also get draft mules. So if you have a draft horse parent, you can end up with really big mules. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know. I have to be honest, I don't know. Like, we've tapped my knowledge of hybrid individuals. But we were talking the other day about boxers having to have C-sections, right? Was that in here? Like, or bulldogs, sorry. It is possible that, domestic animals, things are different than natural animals too. Do you have a question? Somebody back there? Yeah, you?
I was going to say, probably bigger form inside the horse. Definitely smaller.
Yeah. Maybe. I don't know. I feel like somebody's going to at least have to do an organism of the week, right? And like answer some of these questions for us. There's also hybrid like lions and tigers, right? Ligers and all sorts of things that zoological collections do that also probably would never happen in nature. Okay. So what happens when hybrids are formed? So we have, I guess not what happens when hybrids are formed. What happens when species come together because their reproductive barriers break down, right? And so if we have species that have kind of gone off on separate paths and then come back together, what happens, right? Basically, we need to find out, like, are they still separate species? Do they come back and hybridize and form a new species? Do they not have any interest in each other at all? And so I want to talk a little bit about hybrid zones. And a hybrid zone is any area where members of different species are able to meet and mate. So they're able to come together. And so in this example, we have 3 populations of the same species. And so those populations are mostly separate, but every now and then an individual from this population goes here or here. And individuals from this population go here or here. And so because there's some individuals moving between those populations, they're all interconnected. Okay? If we have some sort of barrier to that gene flow, and one of those populations gets broken off because of a river or some kind of physical separation, all of a sudden this species is, or this population is cut off. These 2 populations continue to exchange, and this one is separated away, right? If that happens for a long enough period of time, now we're going off on our separate pathways. This population might become completely different from these 2 populations, which are still exchanging genetic information. And so the hybrid zone would be a place where these 2 populations are able to come back together. So at some point in the future, a pass opens up in the mountain range that separated them, and some individuals get up and go over the pass, and they're like, oh, hey, recognize you, want to mate, right? There's a little bit of hybrid interaction. What happens in this hybrid zone, right? Some individuals are formed. Are these individuals going to become a whole new species? Are they going to be low vigor and not survive well? Are they going to mostly not be interested in mating with each other? What happens? So there's generally, when we observe this in nature, 3 outcomes that occur. And the first is what we call reinforcement. And so in subhybrid zones, the differences between the 2 species that have formed over time are reinforced so that those species maintain separateness. So they stay separate. Okay. This usually occurs because the hybrid offspring are less fit. They are not particularly well adapted to either of the species niches. Maybe they're not great at feeding. Maybe they're not particularly attractive to mates of either species. Something about them causes them not to do as well. And because of that, natural selection favors them staying separate, right? So one example of this that is really fun is found in pied flycatchers. And we have 2 different species shown here, the pied flycatcher and the male and the collared flycatcher, right? So in places where the collared flycatcher and the pied flycatcher are separated by boundaries and can't come together, they look a lot alike, right? Maybe female flycatchers can tell these guys apart. It looks like the collared flycatcher has a deeper white stripe on the side and maybe a slightly bigger white patch over the nose, but they're really similar, right? So if they're in a place where they're not coming into contact with each other, the males have pretty similar appearances. In sympatric populations, so in a hybrid zone, in here, where these two species are coming back together, the collared flycatcher has a much deeper white band, and the pied flycatcher is brown. It's a completely different color. Okay. That's reinforcement. The accidental mistaking these birds for the same species results in offspring that are so low in quality that they actually have a different appearance in those populations where hybrids are possible. And so natural selection is really favored making sure that we don't accidentally hybridize here. So they're capable of hybridizing, they produce offspring, but the offspring are really low quality. And so we try to prevent that from happening because any parent doesn't want their offspring to not survive, right? So natural selection favors keeping them separate. Does this make sense? Okay. You can also have the opposite happen. And so this is another real example in the Lake Victoria cichlids. And here we have dozens of fish species, actually. And these fish species are usually separated by where they're at in the water column and what they feed on. They interact to some extent, but they recognize each other as separate species and only mate with members of the same species. So they're in the same space. There's no physical barrier. They're spending time in the same waters. They're swimming past each other, but they recognize each other as mates and stay separate because of physical appearance, right? So here we have two species. This one is more brightly colored, has a series of dots on the rear fin. This species has its color in the fins only and is in black and white on the body, right? Because of erosion and human activity and farming around the lake, the water has started to be contaminated with particulate matter. So soil is washing into the lake and creating turbid water. And in the turbid water, these two species hybridize because they can no longer clearly see the color pattern that tells them apart. Everybody looks kind of black and white in the turbid water, and so they're accidentally mating with the other species. And in this particular example, they're rejoining. They're fusing back together. The hybrids are capable of reproducing. The hybrids live just fine. So they were being separated by a physical appearance. And now when that signal is gone, they're coming back together. And these two species are probably going to cease to be two species and come back together and be one species because of that hybridization. Right, the hybrids are good. Yeah, the hybrids have equal fitness or similar fitness to both parent species. And so they're doing fine. There's no consequence, like no negative consequence to making the mistake. And so the species are coming back together. And they may have not fully split. They might have been splitting and the color pattern was part of what was reinforcing keeping them apart. And then when they can't see that anymore, they're coming back together.
How is it that a fish with more of those spots on their body than a fish with 3 spots on these fish? Like, why would they lose spots?
So that's a great question. And I don't know like how precise that is because these are diagrams from a book. I haven't looked at thousands of these fish to know that it's always 2 spots versus some having 4 and some having 3. But it's going to be due to the interaction of genes. And so whatever it is about the color pattern genes that were keeping them separate, when those color pattern genes come back together, they produce a new pattern. Um, and it's probably not that cut and dry, right? Just like, my mom and my dad and I all 3 have blue eyes, but only mine go gray. My parents are always blue and mine are sometimes gray. Like there's subtle differences. And so like that's just an easy to think about difference. I don't know how constant that is. Okay. All right. The third option is, oh, class is over. Let me just do this third option and we'll stop. The third option is what we call stability. And stability means that it's kind of like the no consequence option. Hybrids sometimes occur. They're not particularly poor quality. They're not particularly vigorous. Generally speaking, the species continue to get it right. There's a little bit of gene flow, but it's not so much that it starts to change either species. Okay, so this is like the occasional hybrid result, which is that the two species come in contact with each other. They mostly stay separate. There's no horrible negative consequence to occasional hybrids, so you don't see that reinforcement forcing the separation. But there's no advantage either. So sometimes hybrids form. They're generally few. They don't really shift the gene pool of either population. So now it's time for you guys to take your break. And I want you to have your full break because we are going to